Hello friends, Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged episode with Emma Varvaloucas. Emma is the Executive Director of the Progress Network, which is a platform focused on ideas for a better future. One of the things that they do in particular is help us look at long-term trends that we might be missing in the sort of obsession that we seem to have with bad news. They're looking for ways to put current events in a broader context and not assuming that things are necessarily going to go to hell in a handbasket. This was a lovely conversation with Emma. We did talk about the way in which there seems to be a sort of bad news bias. We also talked about potential problems with good news, so-called good news journalism, and she gave us some very practical advice on media consumption in the digital age. We also had a fascinating conversation about her conversion to Buddhism as a college student and the fascinating way that she found herself into that world, and both the gifts of it and some of the challenges and even disillusionment that she's experienced in that process. A lovely conversation, a highly practical one, and a very helpful one. Here's Emma Varvaloucas. Enjoy. Our guest today is Emma Varvaloucas, an accomplished editor and writer with over a decade of experience in nonprofit media. She currently serves as Executive Director of the Progress Network, a platform focused on ideas for a better future. Previously, she was Executive Editor at Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, where she led the editorial direction of one of the most respected voices in American Buddhism and launched initiatives like Buddhism for Beginners. She's edited 2 books on Buddhist practice and is now writing on media literacy in the age of AI and polarization. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
Grateful to have you with us. Joining us from Athens, Greece.
That's right. It's sweltering outside,
Well,
as it always is.
That's at least one thing that Nashville and Athens have in common is the sweltering heat. But, we also have, I guess, one of the world's maybe only full-size replica of the Parthenon here in Nashville.
That's right. I mean, I have been to Nashville one time. I don't think that I saw the Parthenon, but I wonder if it's in better shape than the one here, because I think people are disappointed when they visit the one here. There's scaffolding everywhere, right? They're doing all kinds of work on it, yes. So it's a little bit of a letdown.
Yeah, well, I guess the Parthenon there also suffered at least some of the, World War I? Was it World War I or World War II with some of the bombings, I think, maybe that affected it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're a little better shape. Yeah, we're a little better shape here in Nashville than that. So, well, grateful to have you with us. You're the executive editor at the Progress Network. So tell us, what is the Progress Network?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Progress Network is a hub, generally speaking, for progress-minded people. So we are an umbrella organization for people in different sectors and fields that are sort of unified in their approach to how they look at the world. Optimistic, but backed up by substance and data, and solutions-oriented. And we have also turned into an editorial platform. So we have a weekly newsletter that comes out. It's free. It's on Thursdays. Anyone can sign up. We also have a podcast that comes out twice weekly, interviews, and also general roundup of things in the news that you might have missed that are progress-oriented. So the newsletter and the podcast both focus on a few different things in the news landscape. One is good news stories that have probably not risen to the top of your social media feeds, not being well covered by legacy media for a variety of reasons. And again, I like to call it, positive news you've never seen before. It's less so, small children hugging animals or something like that. The type of things that are very nice. I mean, make us feel good. But it's not about substantive macro level progress. And that's what we try to cover.
Yeah. Give us a working definition of progress. Do you have kind of an in-house working definition of that word?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it means different things to different people, right? So I try to look at it in 2 ways. One is the way of kind of the standard progress community or movement, which is something that exists for people that don't know. And they look at progress as falling poverty levels, falling levels of maternal and infant mortality, greater health, more agricultural output, basically the kind of standard developmental wealth and well-being indicators. It's a very easy definition of progress that it's really hard to argue with. And then we get into progress that I would define as sort of like classical liberalism. So We do track countries both backsliding and moving forward with progress toward democracy. We do count progress for civil rights, something like for women or for gay marriage, LGBTQ rights, and things like that. Generally speaking, putting those things together, along with a little bit of dose of what would progress look like, particularly on a national level in an age of really heavy distrust, really intense polarization, all those things combined. That doesn't satisfy everyone. In fact, it annoys some people, but it's the best definition that I can give for myself.
Your Zachary Karabell, founder of the Progress Network, says, "We are presenting a realistic alternative narrative to push back on the notion that our only option is pessimism and our only path is societal decline." So I guess one of the first things I would want to ask about this is sell us on that idea. That that doesn't seem obvious.
Right. Well, I'm curious to ask you, like, why doesn't that seem obvious? Just given the fact that we're still here, right? Like we're still breathing, we're still having this debate. This is the line that Zachary likes to say a lot, like in the fight between, angels and demons, the fact that we're even still having this debate means that the angels have won out. But I'm curious, like, why that doesn't seem obvious to you that it's not for sure that we're headed for societal decline.
Well, I think that, obviously currently right now in the United States, over the last number of years, we have such increasing polarization, hostility. We have now military in the streets in ways that we wouldn't have had in years past. And so there seems to be this sort of widespread sense of unraveling or fraying of the social fabric. And, obviously there's lots of other places in the world that are not having to deal with these sorts of things. But I think for a lot of people listening to the news, watching the news in the United States, there's this general sense of anxiety over what appears to be an unraveling.
Yeah. And I want to make it clear that I wouldn't argue with that in terms of like the United States is going through a bad moment. I don't look at a lot of what's going on in the United States as progress. Although there are a lot of good things happening in the United States that people are not generally aware of because we're so focused on the Trump show. That being said, if you look at other countries that have experienced democratic backsliding, and forgive me because I forget where the researchers were located who did this paper, but a paper came out in recent months about countries that had experienced democratic backsliding, and it was something like less than 20% of them actually went all the way into authoritarianism, which is to say that there are other countries that are out there that have gone through something akin to what the United States has gone through and come out on the other side. That doesn't mean that a positive outcome is guaranteed. Of course it's not. There are all kinds of ways that this could go sideways. And I think that the uncertainty around where this is going is what's causing a lot of the stress. But there is also no guarantee that it's going to end up in a worst case scenario outcome. There are certainly lots of bad things happening right now, but we are in the thick of it. We're in the middle of it. We don't know how it's going to end. And there are lots of different levers. There are lots of different ways, first of all, that things can surprise us, but also things that people can actually do to change the picture. I like to do as my kind of common example of really surprising things that have happened. Maybe you wouldn't want to bet on this, but things do surprise us. In Senegal, they had a president that was going for an illegal third term, and the situation was much more dire than the situation that the United States is in now. He was jailing his opponents. 2 weeks before the election, to the surprise of basically everyone, he released all of his political opponents from jail, and the elections occurred. And the opposition opponent wasn't allowed to run, but the kind of stand-in for the opposition opponent did win by a landslide. The elections were free and fair, and he's the president of Senegal right now. Where Senegal goes from there is an open question, but these things do happen. Brazil is another great example. South Korea is another very recent example. There are places that we can go that are not necessarily Hungary, Turkey, or Russia.
Yeah, very helpful. At one point you say, or somewhere I read, that you all are seeking to provide an antidote to despair. So kind of unpack for us what those antidotes might look like.
Yeah, so I think one that I talk about a lot is climate change. I think there is a lot of fear and anxiety around climate change. Certainly, if you're speaking to some portions of the left, to the point in which people are wondering, like, should I have kids? And you also have therapists talking about climate anxiety, right? There's a lot going on in the climate world. I mean, emissions are still rising. Let's be clear about that. They are certainly not rising as fast as they used to. And there is talk about when are we going to hit the peak, which could happen sometime this decade. There has been a rapid rollout of renewable energy, countries adopting solar and wind at a absolutely insane pace. You have weird knock-on effects, like Russia invading Ukraine actually turned Europe into renewables much faster because they wanted energy security away from Russia. And there's just a lot of things occurring. So not only is there a story of, hey, actually we are making some headway against the truly apocalyptic scenarios that the IPCC predicted even 10 years ago, those are off the table. We're still not in a, again, best case scenario, but we're certainly not in a worst case scenario anymore. And I'm not sure if people quite realize that. So there's that, just kind of giving people the data and the facts, and also showing them that this narrative about humanity never coming together, humanity is going to just let the world burn and rot, is not true. I think it's really important to provide an alternative to that kind of despair as well, where you kind of just write off humanity and you write off the world as petty, fractured, ineffective, gonna let us all go to hell in a handbasket kind of thing, because there's a lot of good being done out there.
Yeah. I think even like on something like climate change and climate policy, again, there's a sort of, I suppose, in us a sort of bias towards whatever stories are closest to us. Like, right, so in the state of Tennessee, for example, the Tennessee State Legislature has rolled back a number of kind of protections with regard to climate policy. Obviously, the United States federal government as well, under President Trump, is doing similar sorts of things. And so there's, again, there's this sort of anxiety because these stories are so close to us to presume that has to be the trend with the rest of the world. But it's very helpful, to hear you remind us, no, it is a big world out there, and there are lots of people doing a lot of good work with this, even if the people immediately around you are not.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a big world out there, and something that is kind of, again, like a wacky knock-on effect of the U.S. being fairly dysfunctional at the moment is that the world is kind of moving on without the U.S., and that can be a very difficult transition, like we see with the cut of the funding to USAID. That's going to cause a lot of suffering, but it might be better in the long run, because a world that is not entirely reliant on the U.S. financial system, on the U.S. funding, on the U.S. is a healthier one in a whole, right? And they are. Europe is kind of waking up finally. We've got the African Union doing things that they weren't doing before. Like, there's a lot going on outside of Tennessee, outside of the States, outside of the Americas, right? There's a big, wide world out there, as you say.
Your most, I think it was your most recent weekly newsletter, had another example of the decline of extreme global poverty, another remarkable story.
Yeah, I hate to add a caveat to that, the trend lines, the very recent trend lines are not great, particularly because of the COVID pandemic. But again, this is work that people have been doing for many years now. Many people are unaware that if you look at a graph of extreme poverty from 1990 until 2025, it just goes whoop, totally down. Nice hill to sled down if you're talking about extreme poverty. The World Bank actually just raised the level of extreme poverty. It used to be considered as living under $2.15 a day. It's now been raised because of inflation to $3 a day. And that has added some people to the count. There's also been a rough few years, like I said, because of the COVID pandemic and also because of climate change. So there's a little bit of a bumpy ride towards the end there, but there has been absolutely, without doubt, an incredible amount of progress in the last 30 years.
I mean, one of the things it seems that you all do so well is that you look at a trend like that and you ask a lot of probing questions about mechanisms, really what's going on that can help open up a new vista on questions like that and on issues like that. But any further insight into this question about global poverty that might be pertinent?
Yeah. So, I mean, that particular newsletter edition dove into a paper that was done by one of the co-founders of Give Directly. They do cash transfers to poor households worldwide. And they wanted to find out, like, what are the mechanisms of people leaving extreme poverty? What does that look like? Does that mean that I started a business? Does that mean that I moved from my family's farm to the big city? Does that mean that there was a woman in the household that entered the workforce? Did I choose to not have as many kids? Like, what are the, like, what, as you say, getting into the nitty gritty of how that happens? And what they found is that, first of all, if you're one of the economic growth evangelists, you could be very happy because a lot of this is happening purely because of like the trickle-down effects of economic growth. That actually really does change people's fortunes when a country experiences economic growth. But the other thing that they found out is that there's no one answer, and it really depends on national context, what works for people. So in Indonesia, for example, they found that people moving from rural areas to rural areas was really helpful. In other places, they found that wage work was the best thing to do. In other countries, they found like, no, being an entrepreneur was the best thing to do, just depending on where the countries were on the economic ladder, and again, their specific national context. So, of course, he's the co-founder of Give Directly. He wants to put out cash transfers. And so he does recommend that a great way to help people get out of extreme poverty is to give them money to do the things that they know will benefit them economically, number one. So that might be starting a business, that might be staying on their farm, whatever it may be. And number two is to cushion them against shocks, because the other big takeaway from that paper was that there are people leaving extreme poverty all the time. It happens really, really frequently. The issue is that people also fall back into extreme poverty quite easily. And the reason why the overall numbers are going down is because the number of people climbing out is just edging out the number of people falling back in. And the reason that people fall back in are these kind of unexpected shocks, agricultural shocks, a sudden illness, or somebody dies in the house. Things like that, sort of unexpected surprises, right? And if you can cushion people against those shocks, they're going to have a better shot of not only climbing out of extreme poverty, but staying out of extreme poverty.
Yeah. I mean, it's striking to me the way that you're talking about such issues is obviously you're not getting prepackaged in one end of the political, social, economic spectrum. Because, for example, I mean, we've heard you say just in the 15 minutes we've been talking, things that many people would put kind of in the classic progressive liberal end of the conversation. And at the same time, we just heard you say, no, there actually are real benefits to trickle-down economics in a lot of places, which would be kind of anathema to hear some people in the left ever say. So what's it like for you in trying to prioritize reporting, digging into these kinds of facts, and trying not to fall prey to political partisanship or expectations of a given stereotype?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I will say this, it's easier in the job than it is with friends and family. I will say that. Number one, because the Progress Network it's set up explicitly as nonpartisan. So there are things, as you say, that are coded more right or left. There are things that we take a certain position on, like we decide as an organization that our position is that climate change is real and that it's a problem. We've decided as an organization that we think that it's important that people in the gay community are afforded the same rights as other people, right? Okay, we make those decisions that will put us in a certain wing to begin with. But other than those particular decisions, we explicitly say, like, hey, we are nonpartisan. If there is a solution that works, it sounds like we don't care, but we don't have an affiliation to a particular tribe to say that the left is correct or the right is correct. Don't care who is correct. In fact, a lot of the times, both sides are correct in their own ways, or they're correct about some things and not correct about other things. We also try to highlight a lot of bipartisanship for that reason. So part of that is setting expectations, right? I mean, people probably do get irritated with us and just unsubscribe. But it's easier with the job because that's how you get people to trust you.
Yeah.
Versus it's harder with people in your life because you can come off as sounding like a traitor. And you can really surprise people by the way that you're talking about things, precisely because you don't toe the line, as you're pointing out, to like what left people usually say or what right people usually say. But I do think that, in the case of the United States, it would be helpful for all of us to kind of get outside of our little bubble and talk to people that disagree with us.
Maybe try to find some fact that would push against where we might find ourselves trending socially or politically, and experiment maybe with having a conversation where we endorse this fact that would kind of stand in tension with our own kind of potential partisanship. So yeah, I think that's very helpful. You noted a moment ago that you're not doing feel good puppy videos. But how would you think about distinguishing the work that you do from good news or feel good initiatives?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that we are not good news. I mean, we're certainly not bad news, but I would call us some mixture of like data forward good news, or like in the past I've said substantive good news. It's just that I don't think there's anything wrong with good news, right? Like there's nothing wrong with trying to brighten people's day as long as it's responsible journalism. The problem is that it has this like fluffy attachment to it, particularly in the journalism world, that if you're talking about good news, you're talking about something that's not substantive and that you shouldn't be taken seriously. And that's what we're trying to get away from. Now that we've been around for a few years, there are definitely other players in this space that are doing what I would call responsible good news. But it's also a space where you can kind of slide accidentally into a bias, like just how a lot of people talk about bad news bias in the news, which I think is absolutely true. You can also kind of create good news bias, and you don't want to do that either. So I try to separate us out with that too. Like, we're not trying to put lipstick on a pig. For instance, talking about the United States, I'm not going to sit here and tell you like the United States is in a good place right now. I'm just going to try to maybe calm down some of the freak out so that you can distinguish between like a 5-alarm fire and like a 1-alarm fire, right? Like to actually be able to know the difference so that our reactions aren't always just at 10, no matter what happens.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about trends and or social policy that might have fueled increasing polarization of the news. And I didn't know this until I was doing some of the research and getting ready for our conversation, but that at least some make the case that deregulation of media in the Reagan era was a significant contributor to kind of the situation in which we find ourselves. So could you unpack some of that for us and talk to us about how that has unfolded?
I think, are you referring to the fairness doctrine?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not super persuaded. I'm sort of half about how much the fairness doctrine really affected the news in the United States. I think that when we talk about...
Before you go on, could you maybe just tell folks kind of what that is and some of the history of that?
Yeah, and I will give my best off the cuff.
Yeah.
I will say that that's not something that I have looked at really recently. So like my details are not going to be fresh, and I worry about telling people something that's incorrect.
Yeah.
But the general picture is that there used to be regulations in the United States where, first of all, when you presented the political side of one party and their opinion, you had to present the other side. So something like MSNBC or Fox News, when they put on their opinion pundits, like that wouldn't have been allowed. And there was what was the other thing about the Fairness Act, is that you had to give equal time as well. So if you gave, 2 minutes to this political viewpoint, you had to give also 2 minutes to the other political viewpoint.
And my understanding, there was also a prohibition to news blackouts. So that, for example, I remember one episode of apparently a television station in the South was simply refusing to air coverage about the civil rights movement. And and then got in a lot of trouble with the FCC because of their refusal to air those kinds of stories. So the fairness doctrine or affiliated policy also said you got to be reporting things even though you might not like to report these things.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. See, that's what I was saying. I'm not the expert on the fairness doctrine for sure. So we're going to assume that you're correct. And people can also do a quick Google if they're interested. But my understanding is that it only applied to broadcast journalism. And so I'm not sure that even bringing that to bear now on the current landscape of the news would really do that much. We're talking about a news landscape that was much more limited than it is now in terms of the number of radio and TV that you had access to. I mean, now it's just the absolute explosion of voices, not only just on social media, but also online. I mean, just the absolute explosion of new media. I think it would be very, very difficult to put something like that into place now. I do think it's very interesting, for instance, that you don't have like a version of Fox News in Canada, because Canada had broadcasting, or they had journalism regulations that Fox News didn't meet. But I think that we've sort of like passed that point in time now. And I think it'd be very hard to put the cat back into the bag. I think at this point, when we talk about polarization, it has a lot to do with social media algorithms and also instilling the sense that we were talking about earlier, that the thing that you care about the most is the facts and not your political tribe. And that is a cultural project, that has to do with the media, but is also outside of the media.
You had an article a number of years ago entitled "How to Read the News Without Losing Your Mind: 5 Things to Remember Before Giving Up on Everything." Could you maybe kind of work us through several suggested best practices for framing how we read the news?
Yeah, definitely. I should say I'm working on a book on this right now, so I'm hoping that there will be a whole book-length project.
Any title yet for that book?
Right now, it's tentatively titled "What's Going Right: How to Stay Rational and Positive in a World of Information Chaos." Yeah. But we'll see if that remains the final title.
Yeah. So give us a preliminary peek into what you're developing there.
Yeah, absolutely. So it ranges from both like practices for social media that are very practical to like actual media literacy in terms of what you're reading and listening to online or in print if you're still a print person. One of them that I talk about a lot is to lengthen the timeline. Most of the time what we see in the news is like stocks drop to a historic low, or stocks this to a historic high. And it's like, yeah, it's historic because you're talking about like a 6-month timeline. So it's not incorrect. It's just like, it's a little bit misleading. And that happens quite a bit in the news, where like most of the time the news kind of zooms out like at most to a year on year. And year on year does not tell you very much. For instance, you have year on year between, I think, 2021 and 2024, an absolute skyrocketing rate of drug overdoses and murders and all kinds of crime in the United States. The thing is, most people don't know is that, again, homicides, let's choose that one in particular, has been dropping since the 90s, I believe, maybe even the 80s. And so this uptick that we're having that was around the time of the pandemic, again, it's serious. It warrants our attention. We should look at it. But it is an anomalous uptick that doesn't nearly match the rates that we used to have in the past. Like, we are not reverting, to some murderous time that existed in the past in the United States by any means. It's just simply that we're seeing a small uptick. And understanding those issues on a longer timeline really does change the framing of how you're looking at them. Same thing for teens and smoking in the United States is another one I like to bring up a lot. There was this big vaping craze, maybe 5 years ago, like that everyone was convinced that like there was a vaping epidemic that was occurring amongst teens, again, because the year-on-year uptick of vaping was going up. However, the overall behavior of teens and smoking is like Gen Z is like, they don't drink, they don't smoke, they're complete prudes and straights pretty much. And again, that's been going on for some years, that generationally, the number of people that smoke in the United States is very, very low. And even with vaping, it turned out to be like a 2-year anomalous tick up, and then it went back down again. So that's the number one thing. Like if you are looking at something in the news and it is year on year, 6 months, 3 months, understand that you're looking at the tiny little section of a trend, and that doesn't actually tell you about the long-term trend at all. So if you really want to have...
expand the timeline and get a larger perspective on the issue at hand. What other key practices?
Yeah, I like to borrow one from Hans Rosling to pair lonely numbers. So anytime you see like an eye-popping number in the news, try to find what the denominator is. This one I talk a lot about is measles. There's an article that I quote from Fox News. This is from 2019. So this was pre the measles outbreak in Texas in 2025. And it was an article that was saying, 190,000 people die of measles per year. And then they went on, to have an opinion piece about tightening immigration, which, like, fine, you can have an opinion about tightening immigration, and that might be a totally valid opinion, but it's totally not valid to pin that on measles, because 0 people die from measles in the United States per year. That has, again, like, in 2025, we have had 2 people die, but again, it's a very, very small number compared to measles incidents globally. So always pair a lonely number. If it's just by itself, you don't know what the context is, you don't know what the denominator is, make sure that you understand before you buy an article's arguments wholesale. And a last one I would say that more has to do with like practical, actually how you're consuming media, is to make sure that the way you do it has edges, meaning like you want to have something in your life that has a start and a finish with media. So if it's a podcast, it has a start and finish. If it's a newsletter summary, it has a start and a finish. Things that don't have a start and a finish are much more difficult to manage. That's why social media is so addictive. You have a never-ending scroll. There's no beginning. There's no end. There's no sense of like, okay, I've done my duty for today to be up on the news, and now I'm closing this out and I'm moving on to the rest of my life, which I think is detrimental to our mental health. So whatever medium you choose to participate in with the news, just make sure it has a beginning and an end on whatever basis that is, weekly, daily, even hourly if you're that intense.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I don't think I've thought about that way. I think that for me, it's too often a kind of continual input from a variety of sources, online and radio. But I don't think about it in terms of a discrete beginning and end, which raises another kind of possible practice for me, as you were describing that, of I seldom, if ever, I don't know that I've ever done this, set for myself some sort of conscious intention for why I am listening to the news. I think if someone were to push me, I would say, well, I think it's kind of a civic duty to, as you were saying, there's a sort of civic duty to be informed and engaged. But I don't think, it seems that we could drill in a little closer and say, okay, what's my intention for listening to this news right now? Or why am I scrolling this particular site right now? And setting some sort of parameters for the purpose behind it seems like that might be a helpful sort of exercise.
Yeah, 100%. And what news would you like to know about? Because there's quite a lot of different types, and I don't think you need to know about everything. But you can know a lot about the things that you care about, and less about things that maybe are not as important to you. And I think that that's fine.
Yeah.
I also think that, people pay attention a lot to what they eat and their diet, but they don't pay attention to their media diet at all. And it affects us, maybe not just as strongly as food, but certainly it affects us.
Yeah, right. What do you think about, Thomas Merton, the famous 20th century author, monk, Catholic writer? As I recollect, at least, he one time said, if something is really news, it will still be news 6 months from now. So I don't need to spend a lot of time worrying, always being caught up on everything that's happening. How do you respond to that? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think that's absolutely correct. For somebody that's like in the news all the time, like a lot of that stuff, a lot of the things that really change life and really change the world are like big picture trend lines that are not well covered in the news, are in fact very difficult to pick up on when you're reading the news all the time. There is an outlet, and I cannot recall its name right now, but they specialize in slow journalism. So they only cover stories when they're like 3 to 6 months old.
Fascinating.
So things like that do exist. They're obviously not the norm. But I think that it's absolutely the case that, if you went into a traditional Tibetan Buddhist retreat for 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, and you came out on the other end, it'd be a lot clearer what actually mattered in that intervening, 3 years than if you're constantly scrolling on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into some of the conversation I'd like to have next. How has your own Buddhist practice and work been helpful to you in the work that you do?
Yeah. So first of all, I would just say from Buddhism, I have taken the mindset that your mind is a very powerful thing and that you have limited control over external circumstances, but you have an enormous amount of control over your own mind and how you engage with the world and people around you based on what's going on in your mind. So I would say that. From a more like zoomed in perspective with the work with the Progress Network, there's this Buddhist, I'll paraphrase it because I'm not going to be able to say it by heart, but it's essentially if you pour a salt shaker into a glass, it's going to taste a lot more salty than if you pour a salt shaker into a river. And I do think that a lot of the news that we get from mainstream media is very negative, very toxic, and it's going to taste a lot saltier if you don't balance it out with some substantive good news.
How have you found, or what have you found from Buddhism that has helped you train your own mind to not overreact to the negativity in this age of doom scrolling?
Yeah, well, one of the first things that you learn if you're in a Buddhist tradition that practices meditation, because not all of them do, is to start watching your own mind and figure out how your own mind works. So if you're practicing sitting meditation, if you do it not consistently enough, you start to understand the patterns of your own mind. There's a Buddhist monk named Thanissaro Bhikkhu, and he talks about the committee of the mind and getting to know who's on your committee. So it's kind of like a board of directors of a nonprofit, right? Like you have the grumpy guy, you have the guy that's always looking at things, with kind of rose-colored glasses. You have the guy who thinks everything's going to turn to shit. And you start to get to know what's going on in there. And I think that's also paramount when you're trying to engage with the world, because if you don't take care of your own reactions first, like you're never going to be of use to anybody else. And just understanding, like, what am I being reactive to? How is my engagement with the news affecting me, my body, like while I'm doing it? What do I feel like when I'm scrolling on TikTok? What do I want to feel like? All of that stuff, like that question of like what's going on inside of me, and then how do I fix that so I can actually turn it around and be positive? All of that for me is from Buddhism.
Yeah. It is fascinating. I mean, I think I didn't really begin to think about this notion of the power that we have to observe our own mind thinking, and then even to begin to observe our mind thinking about our mind thinking and so forth, until the last decade or so, and it, maybe a little more than that. But this sort of, for me, it came from rumination that was just driving me batty, and so I needed to find some sort of way to kind of back up from that and find some other way to navigate some energy away from that rumination. But it does seem that this is maybe one of the things that makes us. I don't know if there are other mammals or creatures that are able to observe themselves thinking, but it certainly seems to be something that's certainly very specific to us, that I think as human beings that oftentimes I think we certainly give insufficient attention to. But it's almost like a superpower, isn't it? That we can observe this, and then in the fact of observing these various cycles of thought, or as you were saying, the different people sitting on the board in our mind, then we can kind of begin to make some choices about how much energy or attention that we're going to give these different voices. So I don't know, any other commentary on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say that's very resonant with me about the rumination, because I was a very angsty teenager and I was very angsty in college. And I lived in Nepal for a short time at a monastery program. And the first time somebody told me, like, you don't have to listen to your own thoughts, I was like, what a relief, you know? Like, I would love to stop listening to my own thoughts. If your mind is not a welcoming place for you, which it wasn't for me at that time. So that first of all, yes, absolutely. And second of all, the magical thing about, as you say, making choices is that, and neuroscience backs this up, which we've covered in Try School a lot, and people in the Buddhist world at least are very enthusiastic about, you can change your behavior. And not only that, you can actually change the default neural pathways of your brain. Like, neuroplasticity is a real thing. Mm-hmm. And that means that we are moldable. We can actually choose how we want to show up. I mean, how depressing would it be if it was just like written in stone, right? And like that was it. And that was just the way you're born and whatever. But it's not like that at all.
Yeah. Has that change for you come primarily through practices of meditation or other practices?
I would say that Buddhism set me on a path. And I always hesitate to say this on podcasts because sometimes my mother listens to them and I get some texts. But psychedelics were also very helpful for me in that realm. Huh. And also going to therapy. That was also wonderfully effective in terms of understanding that I am creating the world around me and that it's my own doing. Yeah. And it's my own way of seeing things, and it doesn't have to be that way.
We had one guest of some celebrity years ago, Rainn Wilson, who spoke very critically of the use of psychedelics, and he spoke of it as a I think his phrase was that it was like an attempted shortcut at spirituality. But what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I don't think it's a substitute. I think it's a little bit like getting dropped off by helicopter onto the top of Mount Everest, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's certainly an experience. It's probably a pretty profound experience. Is that going to accomplish the same thing as a consistent spiritual practice? No. But I do know people, myself included, and other people that are very close to me, that they really needed that jolt to kind of get them onto the path. Like, I can't see myself being interested in Buddhism and then extrapolating from there, doing a lot of the things that I ended up doing in my life because I got interested in Buddhism without psychedelics. I really needed, I was not someone that was interested in religion growing up. I was not spiritual or religious at all. When I converted to Buddhism, everyone in my family was like, really? You? Okay. And that wouldn't have happened without something giving me an opportunity to see that the mind is malleable. And psychedelics were my first. I didn't mean for that to happen, but that's what happened. And it was very important to me.
Yeah. You mentioned spending that half a year studying at a monastery in Nepal. Any other things stand out to you about your experience of what you learned during that period?
Oh, what I learned in Nepal. Well, I think to follow up on the psychedelics discussion, I think the difficulty with psychedelics is if you get stuck there, right? And fooling yourself into thinking you have some kind of permanent solution. And that was my other takeaway from Nepal, is that once I got back, when I was in Nepal with Buddhism, I was 100% certain that I had found the secret to happiness in life. Like, I was like, oh, this is it, like, done. And when I got back, and like fast forwarding maybe 10 years later, I became quite disillusioned with Buddhism, not because of the practices behind it, but because of people. And because with any religion, you do end up with religious institutions, and people are people. And it caused me quite a lot of pain to move from absolute certainty into disillusionment. And so I think that's the other lesson that I pulled, where it's like you really need to be, you can't be rigid. You can't be rigid even with spirituality that's trying to make you more open and flexible. Like, as soon as you start to think like, this is done, we're done, you become stagnant and you end up into a stuck place. So that would be my other really big lesson, I think.
You just mentioned, you just used the word religion. I've heard other people refer to Buddhism as a philosophy, as opposed to a religion. How does that work in your mind?
Yeah, I think that's wildly mistaken. And I think that's only because of I think it's because of the way that Buddhism has been kind of taken up in the West, that it seems like a popular alternative for people that want to get into some kind of religious/spiritual practice, but they don't want to be in religion. And they also want it to sit comfortably next to their own religion, which is fine. I'm not against that by any means. But it does cause a lot of misunderstanding, because Buddhism, as it is practiced by millions of Asians in particular, is 100% a religion. And it's only in the United States and something that what you might call the global West, where they have this idea that it's not. But it would fit any definition of a religion.
Just for sake of clarification, would you give us a definition of religion that you think it fits?
Yeah, I mean, it's a belief system. It has rituals. It has institutions. And it's, I guess that's a good question, right? Like, how would you definitionally separate religion and spirituality? And in my mind, Buddhism is like a set up system, right? Like, it's Catholicism has Vatican City and the Pope, right? Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, also has a leader. I mean, there are institutions in Korea that run Korean Buddhism. And I think people don't realize that when they're thinking more of like secular Buddhism that's popular in the United States.
I was fascinated. In the last year, I was being interviewed by someone, and he was asking me lots of questions about my childhood experience of growing up in the particular denomination I was raised in, Alabama. And he began to probe into some of the more unhelpful aspects of that experience, and some of the kind of psychological damage that it caused to me, and I think causes to others. And the producer who was taping this session afterwards, spoke to me off to the side, and she said, I was raised in a Buddhist sect. And she began to describe these fascinating experiences that had remarkable parallels to things that I had just discussed. And I think this was very counterintuitive to me, because I think, I had a sort of naivete perhaps about that Buddhist practice wouldn't fall into that kind of sectarian and or sectarian kind of practice that could have that kind of damaging impact. But it was fascinating to hear the parallels, and it was just so unexpected. So I think some of that feedback that you're giving us there is quite helpful. One of the critiques that I've heard of some Buddhist practice, and I've heard this especially from some Christian theologians, is that it can inculcate a lack of concern for historical or social realities. That because of some Buddhists' warnings against notions of hope, say, that attach some sort of desire for some sort of unfolding set of circumstances in the future, and that Buddhist practice would call you to detach from that could then lead to a detachment from concern for social political realities. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a critique that exists in Buddhist circles as well. It's a really common one. So it's not one that the Buddhists are unaware of.
Yeah.
So there is actually a flavor of Buddhism in the West called engaged Buddhism that is set up precisely to kind of combat that notion, that kind of narrative of like the Buddhist monk alone in the hut on the mountains, right? And there's certainly some truth to that. If you're talking about the historical Buddha, which is Shakyamuni Buddha, which is in the Pali Canon, which is kind of like the oldest extant canon that came out of India. The rest of the Buddhism sprouted after that. So if you're talking about Chinese Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, etc., that comes after Indian Buddhism. And it is true that the Buddha very famously in the Pali Canon refused to engage in politics. So he refused to give kings advice on wars and things like that. And I think that there's value to that. I mean, there is certainly value to not being engaged with politics and with the changing nature of things. But there's also value in the critique of saying like, hey, we can't just close our eyes and become navel-gazing meditators. And that's why things like engaged Buddhism exist, where they actually put in the forefront of their practice an engagement in the world that aligns with Buddhist ethics. And that looks like all different kinds of social justice work. There's one very famous monk that does a lot of food insecurity work. If people are familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, who is from Vietnam, he was also someone that was very involved in politics in Vietnam, to put it baldly, and also social justice projects after he left Vietnam. So I would say, yes, the critique is valid. Like there are ways that you can look at it like that, but not necessarily the way that people always practice Buddhism.
Yeah. You mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh and engaged Buddhism practices. How would you see your own work that you're doing with regard to media as simply a practice of peacemaking? That's
the whole point, I guess I would say. I am somebody that has always wanted to be a journalist, but it was very important to me to be in a kind of journalism that I felt was of use to people and in service, which I feel like is more of a Christian term than a Buddhist one. But I really felt like I wanted to be on my deathbed thinking that I had at least given more to the world than I had taken from it. I'm not sure really where I'm coming out on that net, to be honest, but that is the intent. And I want people to be able to flourish. And that's why we do focus a lot on the mental health and how you engage with the news. I want to heal the rifts that are occurring, particularly in American society right now, which is why depolarization work is very important to me. It's how I ended up in a relationship with somebody who was a Obama-Trump flip voter, whereas I have voted reliably blue my whole life. And I want people to have a healthy mindset about humans as a species and what we're able to accomplish so that we can build something we're really proud of. I think that humans have done a lot of remarkable things already, and there's no reason why we wouldn't continue to do remarkable things as long as we don't give up on ourselves.
You mentioned that earlier that you were not, you would not have called your younger self religious or spiritual, and yet I understand that at NYU as an undergrad you studied journalism and religious studies. How did you find yourself into that kind of course of study, and why do you think that you wanted to hold those two especially together at that time in your life?
Yeah, so that was the psychedelics. That was what happened there. So at NYU, they don't consider journalism to be a quote unquote normal major. It's within the School of the Liberal Arts, but it's considered more like a craft. So you actually must double major in something if you are a journalism major at NYU. And I wasn't sure going in what my second major would be. I was already interested in philosophy, and I had done some philosophy courses when I was a freshman. The psychedelics happened around then, and that jump-started a very intense interest in Buddhism and how I got into religious studies. Looking back on it, NYU as an academic institution did not have a good Asian religions program. It was much more Judeo-Christian focused, so it was not the best place to be to study that. But that's where that interest came from, and that's how I ended up in Nepal in my junior year as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're how many years out now are you from your experience in Nepal?
Let's see. It was 2011.
So, okay. So 14 years or so out from your experience in Nepal. And you've already graciously kind of allowed us a glimpse into some of the sense of frustration or disappointment that you experienced maybe 10 years out of that experience. But in just thinking about yourself, what would you say are some of the internal challenges or mental challenges that you still find yourself getting frustrated with, that you still want to find a way to make progress, and that you're kind of currently trying to work through and get some traction on?
Just as a person?
Yeah.
Ooh. Well, let's start out with I'm not very good at talking about my personal internal feelings and psychological processes. I am working right now, and I think this is why, in part, that I'm like drawn to kind of positive news, is that I feel like I've kind of drunk the Kool-Aid with my job. Like I genuinely do feel positive about the potential of the world when I look out at things happening. But I am not like a positive person internally by nature, I would say. I can fall pretty easily into self-doubt. I can fall pretty easily into loneliness, having low opinions of myself, low self-worth, and things like that. And those are all struggles for me that I think most people would not see from the outside, but that I would like to fix from the inside, because I've seen friends go through this process where they genuinely believe in themselves. They are genuinely excited about what comes next for them. They are kind of sparkling with energy in their personal relationships. They feel loved and they're able to offer a lot of love back. And I feel like I'm a little bit like fake it till you make it on that right now. But I would like that for that not to be the case. Like when I was younger, I was always really attracted to, again, I wasn't a religious person, but I was attracted to people that had like gone into monastic life, particularly women that had gone into a monastic life. And that has stayed with me throughout my journey with Buddhism, that I love the idea of being somebody in which when people come into contact with me, they feel warmth. And I don't think that you can effectively do that unless you're coming from a very like internally healthy place. So that's my challenge at the moment.
Been talking to Emma Varvaloucas. She's currently the executive director of the Progress Network and also the co-host of the What Could Go Right podcast. Emma, if folks want to sign up for your newsletter or find out more about your work, where would they go?
They can go to theprogressnetwork.org, or they can find us on basically any social media channel at The Progress Network. And yeah, keep up with us in whatever way you like.
Emma, it's been great to visit with you today. Thanks so much for your work, and thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was a great chat.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Harriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.